Now that that's over, let's move on to the Storz lecture. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege to stand before you today to honor a true pioneer in the field of surgery, Dr. George Berci. His remarkable journey from surviving the horrors of World War II to revolutionizing modern medicine is a testament to resilience, innovation, and an unwavering commitment to patient care. Dr. Berci's contributions to minimally invasive surgery have transformed the way that we operate. His pioneering advancements in laparoscopic and endoscopic imaging have allowed surgeons to perform complex procedures with unparalleled precision, reducing patient trauma, recovery time, and complications. His work at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center helped develop cutting-edge surgical visualization and instrumentation, making minimally invasive surgery the gold standard in operating rooms worldwide. Beyond his innovations, Dr. Berci has been a cornerstone of SAGES, the Society of American Gastrointestinal and Endoscopic Surgeons. As a founding member, he played a pivotal role in shaping surgical education, training programs, and standards that continue to guide the next generation of surgeons. His dedication to mentorship has left an indelible mark on the field, ensuring that his legacy lives on through countless medical professionals he has inspired. For his groundbreaking work, Dr. Berci has received numerous honors, including Lifetime Achievement Awards, global recognition from SAGES, and prestigious accolades from Cedars-Sinai. But his greatest achievement is the profound impact he has had on the lives of patients and surgeons worldwide. Dr. Berci, we thank you for your vision, your perseverance, and your contributions that have forever changed the landscape of surgery. Your legacy will continue to inspire generations to come. And before we hear from Dr. Berci, let's hear from Dr. Rick Greene.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chris. I cannot think of a better event to celebrate the extraordinary life of George Berci, who would have loved to have been here to participate in the meeting of his favorite organization. I had the unique privilege of knowing George for only 45 of his 103 and a half years, but many wonderful and memorable times were packed into those 4.5 decades, and many occurred at SAGES. George loved seeing present and former colleagues, and especially meeting young surgeons who equally loved meeting George. George valued the science shared at SAGES, and he also loved a good time. As one of the original lap rappers, he reveled in the uniqueness of our annual SAGES sing-off. And I assure you, he will be listening in tonight. George was so passionate in the role that SAGES needed to play in educating surgeons, especially in the unique use of endoscopic procedures to manage biliary tract disease. As many in this audience can attest, he constantly pushed all of us to get the message out that surgeons should be the sole arbiters when it comes to taking care of surgical illnesses. Although many great memories abound from my George Berci period, the best 2 years for me were during the COVID pandemic, when we were bi-coastal soulmates. George asked me to help him write his autobiography, and I jumped at the opportunity. He would send me snippets of his life by email, and I would convert these into prose. Anyone in the SAGES family who has received an email from George knows what I mean. We would talk on the phone incessantly during those 2 years, and many of our conversations centered on the unique role that our organization has played in the global surgical arena. While I recommended a virtual format for communicating, George often had challenges with the Zoom links. He would say to me, "Rick, let's do Face." It wasn't FaceTime for George, it was Face. This was George. He wanted to see you, and he wanted to be seen. He loved the personal engagement with clinicians at our SAGES meetings, and especially with young residents and fellows who were launching their careers and giving their first presentations at SAGES. For George's autobiography, we selected the title, "The Scope of My Life." I am sure that all of you here understand that double entendre. George spent 7 decades creating and promulgating endoscopic technology that has benefited thousands of clinicians in a multitude of medical specialties and millions of their patients. It was at our SAGES meeting and the World Congresses that involved SAGES that George shared his knowledge and incredible vision. Now, we can never talk about SAGES and George without talking about Barbara and George. Some of us, let us say the more seasoned members of SAGES, first realized that George and Barbara were already an item when the first World Congress of Endoscopy was held in Berlin in 1988. Barbara Salzman was there as our administrator of SAGES. Yes, the most important aspect of SAGES for George was that our organization brought both of these beautiful and talented people together. Their efforts were instrumental in creating the SAGES Education and Research Foundation, which, by the way, is the beneficiary of all sales of George's autobiography. Today, March 14th, would have been George's 104th birthday. I cannot think of a better way than honoring our beloved colleague than to make a contribution today to the SAGES Foundation. I will close with a Zen proverb. Knowledge is learning something every day. Wisdom is letting go of something every day. George loved learning every day of the 10+ decades that he was on this earth. He especially loved learning and sharing his wealth of knowledge at his favorite meeting, SAGES. As a Holocaust survivor, George managed to let go of some of the pain that he personally experienced caused by man's inhumanity to man. Today at SAGES, we celebrate our good fortune of having had George Berci in our lives. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce a video message from Dr. Michael Brunt.
I met George Berci at my first SAGES meeting in 1992 at the outset of the laparoscopic revolution, and I'm sorry to be missing my first SAGES meeting since then. I had little inkling of his contributions at that point, but he seemed very serious and all business until the appearance of the lap wrappers on Friday evening of that meeting. Our first real connection was during the 2001 meeting in St. Louis. I chaired the hands-on CBD course, which he helped teach, not aware then that he was the master of the CBD. Later in the meeting, George wanted to meet some of the faculty in anesthesiology at WashU about a new video laryngoscope he'd been working on, and offered to drive him to the medical center. More on that in a bit. When Steve Schweitzberg asked me to put together a film about George when he turned 90, I had no idea what an amazing life this humble man had led. George and his wife Barbara, a SAGES icon herself, welcomed me into their home for the filming in LA and opened up about so many stories that are an indelible part of George and Sage's. If you haven't seen the film, please take the hour to do so. There are also supplemental vignettes that show a more personal side of George about his love of watches, fondness for bananas, and how, among others, he helped save bridges in Australia. But back to video laryngoscopy for intubation. George was in his late 70s when he worked on this, and it's now become the standard across hospitals throughout the US and beyond. Better visualization, enhanced teaching, and overall improved safety. It's a simple concept, but it took George to bring it to common usage. Exactly 4 weeks ago today, I underwent an emergency thoracotomy. The anesthesiologist on that case intubated me with a video laryngoscope. That scope was made by a company that George did extensive instrument design and development with. I really believe that George, in a way, had a hand in helping save my life that day, as he has for countless patients over the many decades of his career, and he's improved the quality of life for millions of patients through his innovations in optics illumination and instrument development. His impact is not just during the laparoscopic revolution and the decades since, but will continue throughout this century and into the next as well. I am confident in saying that never again in the history of surgery will one surgeon impact the entire field of surgery as extensively and over as long a period of time as George has. What I'll remember most, though, is George's personal side and his kindness, humor, and quick wit. Whenever we would talk, he would always ask about my family and about hockey and how is the guitar. I called George on his birthday in his late 90s and said, "George, I hope I'm as sharp as you are if I live to my late 90s. And he says to me, "I tell you what, I won't call you then." When I last visited George at his residence in LA while he was recovering from a fall, we were returning from lunch and he was motoring down the hallway with his walker head down, and a shopping cart started to pass in front of us. And I said, "Watch out, you may fall into the cart." And he said, "Then they would have to sell me." That was George to the very end. And in the end, the life you live and what you give is so much more than what you receive. Happy birthday, George. We miss you, but know your voice will be with us forever. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Katherine, known to some of you as Kitty, George's daughter. And today is very important because, yes, it is George's 104th birthday. We cannot speak about George the surgeon, innovator, and pioneer without touching on George the dad and the husband. In fact, he was a husband to several times over, 4 to be exact. But they were awesome women, and as a result, I was the lucky beneficiary. First, my mother, Irene, nursing director, smart and feisty, taught me strength in the face of adversity. Susie, his third wife, the beautiful ballerina, who taught me inner elegance and kindness. And lastly was Barbara, the businesswoman, activist, founder of BSc Management, and friend to many of you in this audience. She was wickedly smart and one of the best humans I have ever had the good fortune of knowing. Amongst many things, she taught me compassion and the power of walking your talk. The Kardashians had nothing on us. Our family tree was more like a soap opera, but clearly with much better outcomes. As an added bonus, Susie and Barbara came with 2 children of their own, and voila, I had siblings I always wanted almost overnight. I think I can safely say, though, that we became the poster children for an amazingly well-blended family. Dad was an old-school European man. Although less warm and fuzzy for us kids, it was more of a cerebral, intellectual connection with guidance. I recall being grounded for the entire summer under house arrest for sneaking out at night to meet a boy who was not on the list of approved choices. And then there were the house rules. Dad's house rule number 1 was nightly dinner at 6 p.m. sharp. Sharp. Attendance by all family members was required and non-negotiable. Discussions ranged from politics, music, to world news and school items, especially report cards. Punishment for poor grades was handled swiftly, with more grounding. But most importantly, this is where we as children learned old school values, a strong work ethic and manners without cell phones or social media. Dinner table discussions were often lively and occasionally heated, but we left the table feeling warmth, love, and engagement with a strong sense of a family bond. The gifts Dad gave me were many, but one of the most significant was music. At the age of 7, Dad gave me a violin and said, "You will play." I said, "No, I won't." He won. The rest is history, and I'm forever grateful. As many of you know, Dad was also a violinist in his teenage years. One of my fondest memories was when we played duets, arguing about who was flat or sharp, or one of us was pushing the tempo. He didn't win many of those. But between Dad's wicked sense of humor and making music together, those were some of my most precious moments. He was not perfect, but he had a knack for attracting incredible people into his life and into the lives of those of us who were lucky enough to be part of his family or in his company. I can only speak for myself, but by his choices in life, he improved mine exponentially. Happy birthday, Dad. This was his happy place, and he misses you all. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm SAGE's Executive Director, Sallie Matthews. Clearly, we did not compare notes on what we would say about George, so you're going to hear some common themes, which speaks even more about the man that we all grew to know and love. Thank you, Dr. Schlachta, for the opportunity to participate in the opening remarks to honor the incredible life of George Berci. You've heard about what George meant to the field of surgery, to SAGEs, as a husband and a father. I'd like to share just a few more stories about George the human and the friend. I knew George from my very first days working with SAGEs in 1993. And of course, his wife, Barbara, was first my boss, and then my mentor, business partner, and cherished friend. They quickly became not only colleagues, but friends and chosen family. Like Barb, as Kitty mentioned, George was a musician early in his life. A gifted violinist, he surely would have had a future in music had he not chosen the path of surgery. We connected early and often on that note, as I also started in music. About 15 years ago, I watched a documentary about Bronislaw Huberman, a Polish violinist and conductor who single-handedly saved about 1,000 Jewish musicians during the Holocaust. I met with Barb and George, coincidentally, the next day, mentioned the documentary, and George quietly said, "I auditioned for him. He told me to stay in medicine." We shared a laugh at his typical self-deprecating humor. He never let go of his love of music and continued playing violin periodically until just a few years ago. George had a wry and wicked sense of humor. Barb was first drawn to him overhearing him tell an off-color joke at a SAGE's cocktail reception. Can you imagine? He could tell a wonderfully funny story and loved to laugh. Somewhere I have a photo of him with a pair of boxer shorts on his head that belonged to a very prominent European surgeon. Let's leave it at that. He didn't take himself too seriously. George had a genuine love of people. Without exception, whenever I saw him, he would ask about me, my husband, my family, my children, and then, of course, he would lecture me on how sages need to do more to reduce bile duct injury. He truly cared and demonstrated this personal touch in conversations with just about everyone in his life. The isolation of pandemic, as Rick mentioned, was very hard on him. In the fall of 2020, when LA was still on shutdown, George convinced me to pick him up at his home, take him in my car, fully masked, and just talk in person. We spent an hour sitting in my car in a residential neighborhood in West LA. I think I held my breath for most of that conversation for fear that I might personally infect George Berci. I know several of you visited him personally after the death of Barbara in 2018, and he cherished those times more than you will ever possibly know. One of many life lessons from George came about 25 years ago. Barb and I had been through a frightening experience. We were afraid. George met with me, looked up at me in his famous Hungarian accent, which I will not attempt to impersonate, and said, "We do not live in fear." That phrase, coming from someone who survived the Holocaust and many other traumatic events, was deeply meaningful to me as it is now today. And his words ring out relevant today more than ever. Among many blessings in my life, I count near the top meeting, knowing, working with, and being lifelong friends with the Bercis. Being a musical theater geek, of course, I will conclude by quoting the musical Wicked. And I think I speak for all of us when I say this with George in mind. Because I knew you, I have been changed for good. And now what you actually came for, let's hear about George's life from the man himself in this self-narrated video he made only a couple of years ago, The Incredible Life of George Berci.
I'm George Berci. I was born in Szeged, a small city in Hungary. When I was 2 years old, my father and grandfather, who were musicians, obtained a job in Vienna. They decided to move the family to Austria. I spent my life in 4 countries. I started with Hungary, continued in Austria, followed to Australia, and finally ended up in the United States. Living in a musician's family, I had to start to learn an instrument. It was, of course, the violin. I obtained an excellent teacher. My grandfather practiced with me every day. I lost a lot of soccer matches. I became the youngest concertmaster in the high school orchestra, but I learned to love music. I played concertos already at the age of 10. The hairdo was accustomed to the period, and I was considered a second Paganini, a famous violin virtuoso, but I can assure you I didn't make it. Attending the high school in Vienna, one day the teacher came in and called 6 names, including mine, to sit in the back row because we were Jews. This was the first time that I felt that we were selected to be a separate group of the society and became isolated. There were also other serious anti-Semitic movements, therefore my family decided to return to Hungary. Budapest is the capital city of Hungary, with a population at that time of 1.5 million. The city is divided by the Danube, with Buda on the hill, and Pest with the parliament on the edge of the Danube. I was a year away from graduation and started to look for high school. I had problems with my Hungarian language knowledge and, of course, with my religion. I was not accepted in a state high school. The Jewish high school was overfilled and the tuition was expensive. I had to find a job washing cars on the weekends in a garage. After graduating from a high school, I was unable to enter any university because the numerus clausus, which meant restricted acceptance of course for Jews. I took a 4-year mechanical engineering course. The extension of the right-wing groups in Hungary became obvious. Sallie established a cross-arrow Hungarian right-wing party which was similar in function to the SS. Sallie itself received the instruction directly from Hitler. They collected 1,500 Jews each night from the ghetto in Budapest, took them to the Danube and machine-gunned them into the water. The population of Jews in Hungary was 600,000. Approximately 400,000 were deported. Another 150,000 were concentrated in Budapest in the so-called ghetto. Approximately only 50,000 survived. In 1942, the younger male Jewish generation was called to labor camps, organized in military battalions with a military cap but yellow armbands and special guards. We were sent to the Romanian mountains to build a German defense line against the Russian tanks. We had to dig a 6 feet deep hole and create a 6 feet high wall of earth. Some tried to escape, were caught, severely punished or shot. Those who survived, including myself, developed a depressing attitude being in a camp for 21 months. In June 1944, we were put suddenly on a train to be transported to Germany. Taken through Hungary, we stopped in Budapest. The air alarm sirens were suddenly audible, and bomb explosions were heard. The American Air Force bombed Budapest. Our guards disappeared, and suddenly we were free. In 1944, the Russian army broke the German and Hungarian lines, advanced, and in November surrounded the capital city. There were 2 heroes in Budapest. The Swedish consul Wallenberg, who distributed protective passports for thousands of Jews. When the Russians occupied the capital city in 1944, Wallenberg disappeared, allegedly taken by Russians. He never returned. The other hero was Dr. Lutz, the consul of Switzerland, who saved also a large number of Jews by creating a service of protective papers or passports. I was able to help this group, but this is another story. It was a very risky function for 7 months. In December 1944, we were liberated in Budapest, but no food, no electricity, and no water. We decided to get back to Szeged. There were no civilian railway service at the time. We were able to negotiate with some Russian soldiers for a wristwatch to be passengers on a train to the south. We moved back to Szeged, which is 250,000 inhabitants, and had a Catholic Archbishop center, as well as a university with a Nobel Prize-winning Professor St. George for the discovery of vitamin C. I became one of the first medical students amongst 120. I completed medical school in 1950 with summa cum laude, but out of the total of 120, only 3 were women. Going through the various catastrophic events, It was encouraging to hear that a guy called Lenin has established a country with an improved social structure. Stalin took over the leadership for Lenin, but changed a democratic country to a new dictatorship. The Hungarian Communist Party chairman Rákosi followed Stalin blindly and established a system based on fear and terror. The deteriorating economy, the enormous number of unemployed after 10 years, the lack of freedom and free speech led to a revolution. The university students started with a one-day takeover of a radio station and delivered a demonstrative announcement about the problem of the country which needed urgent changes. The next morning, tanks from the Hungarian army appeared on the streets of the capital city, with jubilant people on board. A well-known appearance of jubilant citizens was demonstrated in many cities. In November 1956, behind the parliament building was a prominent square. This area was filled with over 200,000 people, demanding changes for the future, more progressive democracy with an independent leadership. The people did not know that the secret police were placed on the buildings around the area. They started to machine gun the enormous number of people. Within minutes, it became an incredible area of screaming, bleeding, and dying people. A complete chaos was created. At that time, I was a young surgeon without any experience of war injuries. The Department of Surgery received within hours 100 gunshot bodies. Corridors were covered with bleeding and dying people. We ran out of blood, intravenous fluid, not speaking from medications. We operated for long hours with detrimental results and observed young, healthy human beings dying due to lack of treatment. This episode became a lifelong, horrible memory. The Russian leader Khrushchev asked the stationary Russian army, which was in Hungary since 1945, to shoot the people. But they could not be convinced to start to shoot suddenly the same population with whom they lived peacefully for 10 years. Khrushchev therefore withdrew the stationary troops and replaced them with new ones from a nearby country. Suddenly hundreds of tanks or thousands of Russian troops rolled into the city. A huge number of buildings has been damaged, worse from the American bombing during war. They were completely destroyed, huge number of dead bodies found in the streets. The destruction of buildings from tanks shooting from a close range was enormous. The civilian population using handguns or even machine guns against tanks was not effective, but they risked their lives for freedom. One November night, myself and my family escaped under extreme difficulties and arrived in an Austrian village and were directed to Vienna. 100,000 Hungarian refugees arrived to a country with a population of only 8 million, including 800 escaped Hungarian doctors. The Rockefeller Foundation distributed 6 grants. Fortunately, I received one, which proved to me helpful selecting Australia, where foreign medical diplomas were not accepted. We were shipped from Genova to Australia, but the Suez Canal was closed because it was bombed by the British Air Force. Therefore, we had to take a 3-week trip in January, going around Africa, and it was not a luxury ocean liner, to arrive to a country of my future. I selected the city of Melbourne, with a population that time of 1.5 million. Australia is as large as the United States, but at that time had only 12 million population. But this country had more kangaroos and koala bears than human beings. Professor Ewing, the chairman of the Department of Surgery, was extremely helpful to give me some time to become familiar with the language and asked me to establish experimental surgery. I received a job as assistant surgeon and started a project in gallbladder surgery. The incidence of stones outside the gallbladder in the bile duct is 10%. The complication of retained or overlooked stones was very high. I tried the old Nitze cystoscope to find stones, but the results were discouraging. Here is a summary of my history of endoscopy. I was able to visit London from Australia, where I met Professor Hopkins. Harold Hopkins invented the Rodland system, which revolutionized endoscopy. He also introduced the flexible fiberscope. I met Karl Storz, an endoscope manufacturer, in the late 50s and recommended to explore this idea, and he and Dr. Sibylle Storz, his daughter, visited Hopkins. The Storz company took a laboratory model and transferred it into a useful clinical tool and developed the endoscope for mass production. A new era was started. To observe through a eye eyepiece with a monocular view and to discover great detail is extremely difficult. We developed in 1962 the first miniature TV camera to create a magnified image for the examiner, the assistant, and the nursing staff, and video endoscopy was established. Illumination was also important. The arc light produced enormous heat and sometimes exploded. On the right is the small, safe 300-watt xenon light source. Without new optics, better light, and video system, we would have been unable to create or start a new chapter in endoscopic surgery. I cannot close without mentioning Dr. Leon Morgenstern. Arriving at Cedars of Lebanon in 1970, Professor Morgenstern was the chief of surgery. He became a symbol to me for being an outstanding human being, a teacher, a surgeon with excellent knowledge of better patient care. I was of course also impressed with his love of music and making violins. He was an admirable personality, seeing every patient with residence every day. He was scared by my invention, but helped me through difficult time periods, establishing a new department of endoscopic surgery. Thank you, Leon. I would like to acknowledge the continuous help of the previous chairman, Achilles Demetriou, and the present chairman, Bruce Gewürz, and express my gratitude. I had a difficult and interesting life. My conclusion or recommendations for the present generations are as follows. I am adamant, whatever religion one is born with or select is his or her private domain. This person should not be punished, not to speak of being killed. This is a requirement to call ourselves a human being. I am keen on democracy, free speech, and personal freedom. A dictatorship is a disaster. If there are conditions or problems to be solved, we should try to find a compromising solution to improve the unbearable conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, George Berci. Thank you for the breath of your inspiration. And thank you all for joining us this morning.